He never liked being told what to do. Not when he was a kid, not when he was a sailor, and certainly not now. Not at 68, with knees that creaked like old porch boards and a shoulder that still popped from that mess back in '79. Oliver Lynch wasn't a fighter by temperament, but life had taught him how to dig in. Not with fists, but with facts, patience, and a stubbornness carved into his bones like the rings in an old oak. He didn't care for rules that came from committees or signs that got planted by people who never walked the land. He cared for clarity. For things that held, that worked. Things that didn't pretend. That's why he bought the lot. It was 15 years ago now, during a loophole auction no one paid attention to. A forgotten chunk of shoreline on the north edge of a man-made lake. Ugly to some, too much upkeep for others. But Oliver had seen the value. Not in square footage or resale projections, but in sovereignty. He saw that bridge. Half-rotted, overgrown with moss, and he didn't see decay. He saw structure. He saw a system. Something made with purpose once. Something still holding back water even in its ruin. And something no one else wanted, which was just fine by him. It wasn't just a home. It was a perimeter. A line he could draw and maintain with his own two hands. He didn't want a lawn that looked like a magazine. He didn't want a mailbox that matched his neighbor's. Hell, he didn't even want neighbors. What he wanted, what he needed, was control over his environment. After a career in maritime inspections, where sloppiness could mean sinkings or lawsuits or worse, Oliver had built his life around systems that worked. Drainage, retention, load-bearing, water pressure. These weren't abstractions to him. They were gospel. So he rebuilt the bridge. Not for the view, not for Instagram, but because the structure mattered. The peninsula across the water was part of his parcel. A wooded chunk, wild and uneven, registered as a conservation buffer zone. The bridge wasn't just a path. It was an anchor point, pressure sink, a stabilizer. The whole lake balanced in part on the function of that little wooden spine, and nobody but Oliver knew it. And he liked it that way. The folks across the lake, with their million-dollar homes and glass-paneled docks, didn't know a damn thing about subsurface drainage or soil saturation coefficients. They liked their wine cold and their property lines tidy. They waved at each other from paddle boards and talked about goose droppings like it was an international crisis. Oliver didn't go to their meetings. He didn't vote on pool rules. He didn't care how many signatures they got for a new walking path. But he did check the flood valve after every major storm, and he did keep the auxiliary drainage channels cleared of sediment because someone had to. For the most part, they left him alone. A few passive-aggressive letters over the years. Some garbage about easements and beautification. He shredded them without comment. There were occasional intrusions. A drone, a stray golf cart, but nothing he couldn't outwait or outdocument. That changed one night in March. Cold, windy, moon low enough to make the water look like oil. Oliver had been asleep when he felt it. A vibration in the floorboards. A mechanical hum, low and unnatural. He stepped onto the porch with his flashlight and caught the scent of diesel hanging in the wind. No lights, no figures, just stillness where movement should have been. And then the absence. The bridge gone. Just like that. Vanished. The planks, the pilings, the reinforced joints he'd poured himself. Obliterated. In their place, nothing but black water and a scatter of floating debris. No weather could have done that. No rot or erosion. This was force. Deliberate. Industrial. Hydraulic. And it hit him like cold steel in the gut. This wasn't an accident. This was erasure. He didn't shout. He didn't curse. He took photos. Measured bolt stumps. Traced tire marks behind his shed, fat treads, low pressure. Heavy equipment. Entry from the maintenance road on the far side. He knew the type of vehicle. Knew the tools it took. This wasn't HOA kids trying to clean up the shoreline. This was a coordinated operation. In the morning, he found the paper. One page, tucked under a rock, like a threat disguised as policy. No signature. Just a logo from the Neighborhood Development Authority and a phrase. Unauthorized structure removal. Safety compliance protocol. No contact number. No appeal. Just that chilling little line. Any restoration activity must be pre-approved by designated watershed stewardship representatives. He sat for hours after that, on the porch, coffee gone cold, watching where the bridge used to rise. The lake looked different now. The sediment near his embankment had shifted. The shallow shelf was already deeper by inches, and that told him everything. They hadn't just removed the bridge, they'd removed the balance. A temporary fence had appeared by mid-afternoon. Not on his land, not exactly, but close enough to sting. Fresh metal panels, zip-tied notices. Work zone, aquatic safety enhancement. And beneath that, a phone number that led to a dead voicemail box. Shoreline Dynamics, LLC. He didn't call again. He didn't need to. At the county office, he pulled the permits. There had been a reclassification, a subtle one. The lake, once managed under single-owner shoreline jurisdiction, had been relabeled. Now it was a multi-access hydrological influence zone, which meant anyone bordering the lake could claim stakeholder status, could file permits, could argue for shared improvements. And buried in the paperwork, stamped with bureaucratic calm, was the stated objective of the new development initiative: removal of obstructions to natural aquatic flow. That's what they'd called his bridge. An obstruction, not an asset, not a stabilizer, a hazard, a problem. Oliver clenched his jaw so hard it hurt. They weren't after safety. They were after narrative. They wanted the lake to look like no one ever had to hold it up, like it shaped itself, like it didn't need him. He went home and pulled his deed, the one from the auction. It was clear. It was specific. The land, the bridge, the substructure, they were his. And not just in theory, in topographic overlays, in hydrological rights appendices, in real legal ink. He wasn't just angry. He was precise. But anger didn't mean haste. That was the difference. They thought he'd rage, send letters, file noisy complaints. They were wrong. Oliver understood pressure. The real kind. Structural. Geological. Political. He knew what a system under strain did when no one paid attention. It didn't scream. It buckled. Quietly. Catastrophically. That night, he walked the perimeter again. Not with a gun. Not with a lawyer. Just with a measuring tape and a penlight, logging every shift in the shoreline, every unnatural slope in the embankment, every trace of sediment where it didn't belong. And in his mind, a single sentence repeating like a heartbeat: they don't know what they've touched. This wasn't about a bridge. It never had been. It was about who controlled the flow, about who could turn the valve, about who understood that systems, once built, remember what they were made for. He wasn't defending land. He was defending memory, function, the invisible spine of the whole damn basin. And here's the thing no one ever talks about. It only takes one failure, one overlooked release point, one miscalculated volume surge. You can sell 1,000 homes on the illusion of stillness, but if you forget what held the water in place, it all unravels. And when that happens, it won't be the planners or the stylists or the HOA chairs who answer. It'll be the man who kept the pressure gauge clean for 15 years, who warned you in silence. That's where this story begins. Not with a protest, not with a hearing, not even with a confrontation. It begins with a subtraction, a quiet one, a bridge gone in the night, and with it, the first hairline fracture in a system more fragile than anyone was willing to admit. They never asked what kept the lake calm. They just assumed it always had been. Oliver had no intention of educating them. Not with words. But when the water shifts, when the shoreline creeps back in inches, not feet, they'll feel it. In their lawn chairs, in their foundations, in their market values. And when that day comes, they won't find a man shouting at the clouds. They'll find one who's been watching, who still holds the wrench, who still knows the blueprint, and who still remembers exactly where the flood begins. Started small. That's how they always do it. Not with bulldozers or chain link fences, not right away. No, they start with things that look harmless. Orange survey flags, planted like tiny plastic weeds along the edge of his gravel. Then a drone, one of the bigger ones this time, humming just past the tree line like it was lost, then slowing down, hovering a little too long over the south valve box. Oliver clocked it from the porch and didn't wave. He didn't move at all. Just memorized its silhouette, the manufacturer, the payload bay. Not a hobbyist drone. This one had corporate guts. Probably had LiDAR, thermal scanning, maybe topographic readouts. It didn't belong to a neighbor's kid. It belonged to someone collecting data they didn't have a right to collect. A week later, the flags reappeared. Closer this time, pushing past the natural stone marker that had stood at the lot line since long before Oliver ever showed up. Someone was trying to redraw a boundary, not by lawsuit but by presumption. They were testing the response, not legally but psychologically. The way predators will circle before they pounce. He didn't remove the flags. Not yet. He took photos of them in different light, logged their GPS points. Proof wasn't about emotion. Proof was about documentation. Then came the first letter. Not certified mail. Not even a real envelope. Just a laminated page zip-tied to the fence near the waterline. Private project survey in progress, do not remove. The thing about signs like that is they're written to sound official without actually being official. No permit numbers. No agency logos. Just bold fonts and vague language. Like a warning you're not supposed to question. Oliver removed it, ran it through his scanner, and filed it under intentional deception phase 1. Still nothing outright. No name, no knock at the door. Just pieces shifting in the dark. It reminded him of something he'd seen back in the 80s, when a commercial marina tried to muscle into a state-controlled harbor. They didn't start with cranes. They started with noise, with rumors, with repositioned buoys and quiet letters to regional inspectors full of invented concerns. Eventually they got exposed, but by then, 3 good men had already been fired. Oliver never forgot how it unfolded. And now, standing on his own soil, he was watching a variation of the same play. Just polished, gentrified, wrapped in words like watershed stewardship and communal interest zones. 3 mornings later, a new fence panel had appeared. Not a long stretch, maybe 12 feet. Aluminum frame, prefab, driven 2 inches past his boundary. Oliver measured it twice. The intrusion was subtle, but legally it was a provocation. A thin test of inertia. If he ignored it, they'd keep going. If he reacted too fast, they'd paint him as aggressive. He waited, called no one, said nothing. But that afternoon, he took a walk to the edge of the property where the auxiliary trench ran under the ridge. That trench had been stable for 14 years. Now he noticed something new, fine displacement lines along the edge, as if runoff had been intentionally redirected. That night, Oliver retrieved the old maps, the ones he hadn't looked at since the 2nd year of ownership. He laid them out across the dining table. Hand-drawn overlays from the original developer. The valve system, the natural runoff channels, the flood retention data, all of it still accurate. More importantly, it proved what he already knew. The system was engineered for balance, not visibility. His power wasn't in being seen. It was in being ignored, forgotten. And now, someone was trying to claim that invisibility for themselves. 2 days later, they showed up. A white truck, no logo, no plates. 2 men, mid-30s, neat haircuts and matching polo shirts. Clipboard and tablet. They didn't approach the front. Didn't knock. Just started walking the shoreline like it was a model home tour. Oliver watched from the porch, sipping black coffee gone lukewarm. He gave them 5 minutes, then 10. They moved like they owned it, pausing, pointing, taking quiet readings with a LiDAR scope, marking notes without glancing up. When he approached, they didn't flinch, just smiled like they were on a lunch break. "Gentlemen," Oliver said, his voice low, flat, deliberate. "You've got 60 seconds to explain your presence or get off my land." The one with the tablet spoke first. Young face, soft hands. "We're conducting a shoreline condition assessment on behalf of the local community development committee. You're trespassing. We were told this was an accessible shoreline with pending easement status. You were told wrong." The other one, a little older, eyes twitchy, offered a brochure. Full color. High gloss. On the cover, a mock-up of the lake with trails, floating walkways, a gazebo. All of it sketched across Oliver's land. "We're just evaluating potential enhancements for public benefit," he said. Oliver didn't take the brochure. He didn't raise his voice either. He just looked them over, slow and surgical. There is no public benefit here. There's private infrastructure. Documented, recorded, owned. Leave. They hesitated. Not from fear but calculation. Then they walked. Not fast. Not apologetic. Like men who thought they'd be back with better paperwork. Oliver watched their truck roll back down the access road and vanish into the tree line. Then he walked the shoreline again. Slower this time. The flags were still there. The panel still stood. But now he noticed something he hadn't before. A new marker embedded in the water, 20 feet offshore. A floating cylinder, orange and white. It hadn't been there last week. He raked it in with a hook and opened the hatch. Inside, a sonar puck, mapping grade, likely logging lakebed contours. They weren't just trespassing. They were modeling, building digital terrain files, preparing plans. The war wasn't coming. It had already started, quiet, legal, pixelated. They weren't taking his land. They were pretending it was never his to begin with. That night, he wrote a notice. Not for the developers. Not for the HOA. For the county. A statement of system integrity concern. A planned inspection of the valve system for abnormal pressure readings. The valve still worked. He'd confirmed that. What they didn't know was that, with a few calibrated turns, he could lower the lake by 4 inches within hours. Not dangerous. Not reckless. Just enough to shift the balance, reveal a few truths, expose a few artificial banks. And when he filed that inspection notice, he did it by the book. Engineer signature. Timestamped log. Cross-referenced sensor data. They could claim he was paranoid. They could even claim he was overreacting. But they couldn't claim he was wrong. The next day, a pie appeared on his porch. Store-bought. Still cold. Alongside it, a handwritten card. Just checking in, hope all is well. Signed by a neighbor 3 lots down. A man who hadn't spoken to Oliver in over a decade. Oliver didn't touch the pie. He read the card twice, then fed it to the burn barrel. It wasn't a kindness. It was a soft probe. A way of gauging temperature without raising alarms. Later that week, a package arrived. No return address. Inside, a booklet, professionally printed, titled Watershed Realignment, Community Opportunity Brief. Page 12 mentioned cooperative upgrades to legacy infrastructure, including valve assets located at key shoreline positions. His valve, his shoreline, his system. The message was clear. Surrender it politely or be cast as the problem. Oliver didn't flinch. He didn't write back. He simply added the booklet to a growing folder marked involuntary annexation attempts. He understood now what they were trying to do. They weren't just erasing the map. They were rewriting the myth, turning the system he built into something that had always been theirs, and that he couldn't allow, not just because of what it meant for his land, but for what it meant for any man who ever built something that worked quietly, out of sight, and in full defiance of control. He walked the shoreline that evening, boots deep in silt. The lake was calm, deceptively so, and somewhere beneath that stillness, the pressure was building. Systems like this didn't fail all at once. They failed in layers, in silence. Until suddenly, they didn't. They didn't stop. Of course they didn't. People like that never stop until they get what they want or until something stops them. And Oliver Lynch, for all his quiet, for all his patience, had made one thing clear. He would not move, not now, not later, not for them. So they escalated. But not the way most people would think. No, it wasn't torches and pitchforks, not even a lawsuit. Yet, it was more insidious than that. The next morning after the sonar buoy incident, Oliver's utility meter was flagged for an irregular reading. Power shut down for 3 hours while a technician, young, polite, suspiciously nervous, fiddled with the box and muttered about crossed service requests from the neighborhood committee. It was reconnected, but the implication hung in the air. This wasn't a mistake. It was a message. You're not off-grid as much as you think. The day after, a zoning inspector appeared at his gate, clipboard in hand, citing a complaint about unauthorized lakeside structures. The man didn't even know what parcel he was on, kept referencing HOA bylaws that didn't apply, misquoting map coordinates. Oliver handed him a copy of the original government auction deed, complete with topo overlays and federal boundary notations. The inspector took one look, blinked hard, and apologized before driving off without a word. That night, Oliver walked the southern edge of his lot and found a new marker, just a small wooden stake, about knee-height, but with a laminated card zip-tied to the top. It read, "Cooperation brings balance. Resistance invites disorder." No logo, no agency stamp, just that single water droplet icon again, the same one on the redevelopment literature, subtle as a whisper and twice as cold. That was the moment something shifted in Oliver. Not just suspicion, certainty. These people weren't bluffing. They weren't just opportunists trying to inflate value. They were carving their will into the land, rewriting ownership by pressure, bureaucracy as bulldozer. And it wasn't going to stop until someone somewhere said, "Enough." The next morning, Oliver drove 30 miles west to meet with an engineer named Delmare, an old acquaintance through the Inland Water Systems Commission. Delmare didn't smile when he shook hands. Men like that didn't waste effort on small talk. He reviewed Oliver's sensor logs, lakebed contour data, water table readings, and the pressure history of the south valve. When he was done, he nodded once, slow and firm. "You've got strain. Minor, but engineered systems don't lie. Something's pushing upstream." Delmare didn't give advice. He gave facts. And what the facts said was simple. The development group, or whoever they were working with, had started adjusting inflow on their side of the lake. Subtle manipulations, redirected runoff, maybe even controlled releases from retention ponds. All unpermitted, all carefully calibrated to be just beneath the legal radar. What that meant practically was terrifying. Oliver's land, his private embankment, was now acting as a natural buffer, a pressure sink. His shoreline was absorbing the stress of their experiments. And the bridge hadn't been an accident. It was the first domino. Remove the stabilizer, compromise the bank, then claim structural failure as nature's whim. That's how you rewrite a boundary. Not with ink, with erosion. Oliver didn't wait. That night, he filed an emergency notification with the county hydrology office. A formal declaration of system stress and intent to perform a controlled valve calibration within 48 hours. The reason? Preventative inspection under private maintenance authority. Everything documented. Everything traceable. The next morning, 2 county-certified engineers arrived. Young guys, but competent. They looked uncomfortable, as if they'd already been warned this job might get political. Oliver didn't care. He led them around the rear of the property, past the moss-covered hatch that shielded the old concrete valve. The system was still functional, but the pressure readings were creeping higher than they should be. Nothing dangerous yet, but that was the point of the test. Controlled release. Predictive stability. Prevention before reaction. The engineers signed off. Paperwork in triplicate. County logs updated. Authorization clocked at exactly 9:12 a.m. The release was minor. 2% flow. Enough to drop the lake less than 4 inches. But even that small adjustment caused ripple effects across the basin. Literally. By mid-afternoon, one of the floating docks across the lake had shifted at an angle. A survey stake was now visibly above the waterline. On Oliver's side, the sediment began to repattern naturally, reducing strain along the auxiliary trench. Measurable benefit. Documented control. But that wasn't how they saw it. By evening, Oliver's phone lit up. Not from neighbors, but from Delmare. "They're panicking," he said, "trying to file for reckless endangerment of community assets. I submitted our logs. You're covered. Don't respond." And Oliver didn't, because he knew the test wasn't about damage. It was about drawing lines, showing the system could still push back. That night, he sat on the porch, the lake now a fraction lower, calmer. The far shore glistened under the porch lights of homes that never once wondered what lay beneath the surface of their investment brochures. 3 days later, a letter arrived. Formal, legal, branded with the seal of the development's executive committee. It accused Oliver of deliberate disruption of hydrological equilibrium and malicious interference in neighborhood environmental stability. The language was slippery, heavy with insinuation, but legally hollow. Darlene, the lawyer Oliver had quietly retained weeks ago, responded with a 40-page motion citing case law, environmental codes, and 3 instances of confirmed permit violations by the opposing party. Her closing line was simple. My client acted within full rights of private maintenance jurisdiction in response to measurable system destabilization caused by unauthorized upstream manipulation. Further provocation will be treated as harassment. The letter wasn't just defense. It was a warning, a cold mirror held to the face of a committee that thought they were invisible. Still, retaliation came, subtler this time. The barge, a floating pontoon fitted with a speaker system, parked itself near the lake center. Officially, it was for community announcements. Unofficially, it emitted a sequence of tones at dawn and dusk, soft enough to evade noise complaints, but engineered just right to carry across water. Into windows, into sleep. Then the drone came back. Not a consumer model this time. A heavy-duty quadrotor with thermal sensors. It hovered for hours, sometimes pausing directly over the valve housing. Every complaint filed was met with bureaucratic gaslight. FAA compliant. Community mapping initiative. Routine shoreline imaging. No one acknowledged that it never flew over any other property. Still, Oliver didn't respond. He documented, logged every flight, timed every noise, archived every frame of footage. By now, Darlene had a paralegal assigned just to the case. They weren't building a case to fight. They were building a record that would make the other side bleed if they ever stepped into court. And then it happened. Not noise, not letters, not threats, but a physical move. One afternoon, while inspecting the auxiliary trench sensors, Oliver heard the unmistakable sound of tires crunching gravel from the peninsula side, the side where no vehicle should be. He moved quickly, silently, past the tree line and saw them. 3 men in vests, utility colors, unmarked pickup, offloading rebar and PVC pipe, foundation materials. When he confronted them, one looked up and mumbled, "We've got a work order. Realignment footing." Oliver didn't argue. He photographed everything, plates, faces, equipment. The men didn't resist. They knew. It was a probe, a tactical incursion. 10 minutes later, they were gone. The next morning, the county issued a zoning update. The peninsula, pending review, was now labeled non-exclusive shared access. It was a lie masked in policy, a bureaucratic end run around his title deed. Darlene's voice on the phone was sharper than he'd ever heard it. They're going for the trench. If they reclassify it as critical infrastructure, they can override your deed under public easement. Oliver didn't ask what the chances were. He asked what to do. Darlene didn't say fight. She said, counter. And the counter wasn't legal. It was hydrological. That night, Oliver sat with Delmare and a retired systems analyst named Bevins. They reviewed water flow simulations, sediment migration, stress distribution. The conclusion was damning. The new construction upstream was distorting flow, badly. If left unchecked, it would cause a trench collapse within 1 season. And when it did, the release wouldn't be controlled. It would be catastrophic. But there was one option, a full drawdown. Drastic, legal, effective. Lower the lake to pre-development levels. Not destroy, expose. Undermine the illusion of balance that the development needed to sell its fantasy. Controlled reveal. Just enough to make the truth undeniable. Oliver issued the notice 3 days later. Every line filed through proper channels. County, Flood Bureau hydrology oversight. Projected reduction, 38%. Duration, 72 hours. Purpose, breach mitigation and infrastructure stabilization. And when the valve turned, it didn't roar. Aside, the lake fell slow, steady. For inches, then 10, then 18. Shorelines cracked. Floating docks tilted. The lake didn't look picturesque anymore. It looked real, muddy, irregular, honest. The kind of truth you can't Photoshop in a brochure. They had tried to break him with silence, with noise, with letters, with drones. But when the water dropped, it wasn't Oliver they exposed. It was themselves. Because for the first time in years, every line they'd blurred came into focus. Every stake, every permit, every lie. And the shoreline they claimed wasn't theirs anymore. It never had been. And now they couldn't pretend. Not with the water gone. Not with the land speaking for itself. It began with the quiet. The kind of silence that doesn't feel peaceful, but expectant. As if something was holding its breath. After the lake drawdown, Oliver noticed it immediately. Not in the water or the soil, but in the air. No more speaker barge. No drone buzzing like an electric fly. No friendly neighbors with pretext pies or scripted concerns. Even the real estate agents, those ever-grinning termites of suburbia, had vanished from their glossy posts by the lakeside pavilion. The billboard advertising luxury waterfront living, limited lots remaining, had been quietly removed before sunrise, replaced by a blank vinyl sheet that fluttered like a flag of surrender in the spring wind. But surrender wasn't the right word. Not yet. Retrenchment, maybe. Regrouping. They were down, but men like Oliver. Men who'd been through federal audits, who'd stood on rusting freighters with soaked boots and held the line when river gates buckled, knew that silence from institutions wasn't apology. It was strategy. What you don't hear is what kills you. And sure enough, 3 days after the lake hit its lowest point and state compliance officers began their quiet march along the far bank, a new letter arrived. This one wasn't printed on local stationery. It bore the crest of the Regional Land Development Council, an office with jurisdictional tendrils far beyond the neighborhood HOA. It was a notice of reassessment. Nothing threatening on its face, just a procedural update regarding adjacent parcel designation and ecological integration under the Urban Watershed Harmonization Program. But Oliver had read thousands of reports in his career, and this wasn't a notice. It was a blueprint. They were preparing to redraw the map. Not physically, but administratively. The drawdown hadn't broken them. It had triggered their contingency. He read the whole thing by lantern light that night, cross-referencing paragraphs with county codes and digging up obscure clauses from the 2008 flood zoning policy. One they had probably counted on everyone forgetting. But Oliver remembered. More importantly, he understood the tempo. These weren't frontal attacks anymore. They were procedural raids. Sneak across the ledger instead of the lawn. Insert new language into appendices. Slip non-exclusive flow access into a side column where it wouldn't raise alarms, until someone tried to challenge it and found the structure already built. Oliver had called that the silt trick back in the maritime days. Let the mud build around your anchor and pretend it was always there. But this wasn't going to be like that. Not here. Not on his soil. Because now the game had gone state level and Oliver had something they didn't, a memory sharper than paperwork and a paper trail thicker than any political excuse. Darlene, for her part, saw it too. Her email reply to the reassessment packet was blunt. They're soft-pitching eminent domain through environmental language. Your drawdown embarrassed them. Now they want to absorb you. She followed that with instructions to begin Phase 2 documentation. Parcel preservation request under the State Private Conservation Initiative. It was essentially a legal deadbolt. Once registered, any attempt to alter, annex, or repurpose Oliver's land for public good would require not just permits, but statewide ecological review, complete with public comment periods and federal visibility. Red tape so thick it scared off even the most ambitious redevelopment firms. But it had to be done precisely. Oliver spent the next week walking every inch of his shoreline with a tripod scanner and logging tablet, mapping elevation shifts, measuring sediment density, taking thermal readings of soil layers at dawn. When a compliance agent from the Department of Environmental Quality arrived for a surprise site check, he found Oliver midway through installing a new telemetry rig to monitor lateral moisture migration. The man asked how often he updated logs. Oliver said, "Every 48 hours. This bank talks. I listen." The agent nodded and didn't ask anything else. But the neighborhood committee hadn't given up. What they couldn't argue in court or recode on paper, they now tried to erase with narrative. Within a week, articles began appearing on small regional blogs and lifestyle magazines. Anonymous features, gentle on the surface but packed with implication. When one man's control becomes a community's crisis. Who speaks for shared waters? The hidden cost of private infrastructure. They painted Oliver not as a steward, but a relic. A stubborn man clinging to outdated authority at the expense of collective harmony. One piece even claimed, falsely, that his drawdown had caused irreparable damage to a juvenile turtle nesting habitat, complete with stock photos of frightened hatchlings nowhere near the lake's biome. Oliver didn't respond, but Darlene did. She sent cease and desist letters to the publications, demanded retractions, and in one instance threatened a digital libel suit backed by geological data and timestamped drone footage proving zero habitat encroachment. 2 articles were quietly removed. The others stayed, but lost traction. The damage was done, but the message was also clear. They couldn't beat him by force, so they'd try to bury him in perception. That's when Oliver made his move. He didn't publish a rebuttal. He didn't give an interview. Instead, he filed a formal stewardship grant proposal to the state's Department of Heritage and Land Trusts. It was a comprehensive document, co-signed by 2 environmental engineers and reviewed by a retired geologist. It outlined a 25-year preservation plan for the peninsula and adjacent shoreline, including controlled regrowth cycles, erosion mitigation, and wildlife stabilization metrics. But buried deep in its appendices was the detail that mattered most. Any structural change on the registered tract would now require state-level environmental impact reports and funding reviews, which meant if the HOA or their contractor so much as floated another dock within 40 feet of the shore, they'd be tripping federal wire. The grant was approved in 10 days. Quietly, efficiently, irrevocably. The effect was immediate. Construction on the far side stalled. Survey crews vanished. At least 2 for sale signs along the lakefront were replaced with sale pending notices, which Oliver knew meant something else entirely. Insurance underwriters had begun asking questions. Mortgage appraisers were requesting updated water stability data. And suddenly, the HOA board wasn't talking about expansion anymore. They were whispering about liquidity. But even then, they didn't quit. Not fully. One final move came like a rusted dagger. Slow, sneaky, and poisoned. A civil claim filed by a new legal firm, different from the HOA's usual team. It accused Oliver of knowingly creating market disruption through infrastructure manipulation, an elegant way of saying sabotage. It wasn't criminal. It wasn't even solid. But it was timed perfectly. 3 days before his team was set to begin sediment redistribution and trench reinforcement. That kind of work couldn't proceed under pending litigation, no matter how baseless. The delay cost him time, and that was the point. Oliver didn't flinch. He forwarded the claim to Darlene, who responded in record time with a 7-page affidavit listing every confirmed violation, every undeclared construction, every manipulated permit. Included were internal emails, obtained through a records request, where one committee member referred to Oliver's valve as the lever we need to disable, one way or another. The day after that filing, the civil claim disappeared. Not dismissed, just withdrawn, like it had never existed. And with it, the last bit of resistance evaporated. Letters stopped coming. Drones stopped flying. The HOA stopped speaking his name. Because the precedent had been set, and it was dangerous, not for Oliver but for anyone who ever tried to erase him again. He didn't celebrate. He fortified. Sediment work began the following week. Trench walls reinforced. Slope angles corrected. Planting cycles logged. The new shoreline, lower but stable, took on its own beauty, messy, natural, honest. No symmetry, no perfect reflection, just function. He didn't rebuild the bridge. He didn't need to. The peninsula was now a path, not a frontier. The land had spoken, and for once it had been heard. Across the lake, property values flatlined. A few recovered. Most didn't. Expansion plans were shelved. The Lakeside Commons project was officially postponed indefinitely. Investors pulled back. The narrative failed. And Oliver? He walked the shoreline every morning with a notebook and a thermos. Quiet, exacting, present. He knew it wasn't over. Systems like that never vanish. They retreat, regroup, Wait for memory to fade and for documents to age out. That's why, one morning in late spring, he mounted a small bronze plaque at the old bridge's edge. No name, no date, just 5 words chiseled clean and cold. Here stood balance. Remember this. It wasn't a threat. It was a marker, a reminder, for anyone watching, for anyone who thought erosion was only ever physical, for anyone who believed that silence meant absence, and for men like Oliver, men who had outlasted storms and policies, who knew the feel of pressure and the weight of quiet battles won. There was no sweeter sound than the wind moving unbothered through reeds that had finally grown back, on a lake that finally, truthfully, belonged to no one but itself. By the time the cicadas returned and the summer sun hardened the last puddles left behind by spring, Oliver Lynch had become, unknowingly, something more than a man with a deed and a shoreline. He had become a story, not the kind people tell at HOA meetings or whisper about across wrought iron patio fences, but a living blueprint of refusal, of knowing too much to be swept aside, of what it means to hold your ground when everything around you is designed to make you forget it's yours. He wasn't proud of that. Pride would have felt cheap. No, what he felt was something deeper, rougher. A quiet, grim satisfaction that didn't need an audience. Because while the lakeside brochures had vanished and the modular docks sagged like deflated promises, he knew the system that tried to outmaneuver him wasn't dead. It was dormant, and like any invasive root system, it would try to reroute. So Oliver stayed vigilant. And vigilance in his world meant paperwork, pattern logging, pressure readings, soil chemistry checks after each significant rainfall. But it also meant reading people, because now even the people had started to shift. A new face moved into the cul-de-sac across the lake. Young couple, 2 kids, 1 Labrador that barked too much and swam too little. But it wasn't them that bothered him. It was the man who showed up during their second week. Not a neighbor, not a friend, but someone who parked too far from the driveway, wore tan slacks too neat for the heat, and stood too long staring at the water. Oliver watched from the ridge with binoculars. The man never walked down to the dock, never took pictures, but he traced the new shoreline with his eyes and left without speaking. 2 days later, a single white drone returned. Not flashy, not low, just high enough to be legal, just long enough to record. But this time, Oliver didn't bother reporting it. He launched his own, a hobby model rigged with spectrum filters and GPS tagging. He logged its flight path, caught the tail number of the interloper, and forwarded it to Darlene with 1 sentence. "They're testing boundaries again." She replied within the hour. Her tone had changed over the months, sharper, less clinical. Maybe it was personal now. Maybe Oliver reminded her of someone. Her message was blunt. "We reopened the audit. They never closed the file officially. That's leverage." So it began again, not with confrontation, not with letters or lawsuits, but with questions that sounded too simple to be threatening. Requests for survey updates, inquiries into shoreline maintenance schedules, routine check-ins from environmental compliance officers. The machine was waking up again, and it had learned one thing: don't push, slide. But Oliver had adjusted too. He wasn't just a man with a valve anymore. He was a node in the system, and he'd made damn sure that every data point that passed through his parcel flowed through triple redundant channels. That meant county. That meant federal. That meant digital records with timestamps and third-party verification. So when the questions escalated into formal development interest, when a company called EcoVista LLC filed a preliminary zoning interest report suggesting long-term community integration of formerly inaccessible shoreline parcels, he was ready. They wanted the peninsula again, but this time not as land, as a concept, a shared ecological buffer zone, community green space, nature by committee. Oliver didn't respond. He did something worse. He hosted a tour. Just 4 people. A retired state water engineer, a local academic from the university's Environmental Law Center, and 2 journalists from a trade publication focused on private land rights. He walked them through the whole system, not the history, the structure. He showed them the valve housing, the sediment data, the sensor logs. He told them nothing about the HOA, the conflict, the letters. He let the land speak, and it did. By the time they left, One of the journalists had already started drafting. The piece went live 2 weeks later. The Man Who Owns the Floodgate, Private Stewardship in a Public Age. It wasn't flashy. It didn't go viral. But it hit all the right inboxes: municipal engineers, watershed regulators, rural landowners forums. The effect wasn't explosive. It was contagious. Suddenly, the attention shifted. Not toward Oliver as an obstruction, but as a precedent. Other landowners in similar conflicts reached out. Not to visit, just to ask questions. About easements. About retention valves. About how to hold the line without raising your voice. Oliver answered every message, short and polite, with links to statutes and templates he'd memorized better than scripture. And somewhere in that swell of silent solidarity, the development machine slowed. Not because it was defeated, but because it had been seen. For men like Oliver, visibility wasn't safety, but it was insulation. A kind of informal shield that made quiet erasure more expensive. The final blow didn't come from a lawsuit or a drone. It came, almost comically, in a budget meeting. One of the HOA's internal audits leaked. An assessment of projected tax burdens tied to shoreline stability enhancements post-drawdown. It included a full spreadsheet of costs, permitting delays, and flagged parcels. Oliver's name was never mentioned, but Lot 17E, Legacy Infrastructure Parcel, was listed as a permanent vulnerability. Darlene got the document within 36 hours and forwarded it to the State Land Commission with a single clause from the conservation grant. Public planning documents shall not designate protected tracts as liabilities without formal review. The commission launched an inquiry. Not an investigation. An inquiry. Subtle difference. But for developers, it might as well have been a scalpel to the spine. Permits froze. Insurance coverage demanded reevaluation. Lenders paused pre-approvals. The HOA board reshuffled within a month. Oliver, meanwhile, did what he always did. He watched. He maintained. He took a sample of lake silt and mailed it, anonymously, to a local middle school science class that had reached out after the article ran. He wrote a small note in pencil. Real systems leave real clues. Learn to read them before someone else tells you what they mean. That year, for the first time since the bridge was destroyed, something new grew where the foundation had once been: wild rushes, tall, stubborn, beautiful in their own way. He let them be. They were better than concrete, stronger than pylons, harder to claim. By late August, the lake had settled again. Not by control, but by equilibrium. It didn't look like a resort anymore. It looked like what it was: a body of water with memory. And Oliver, walking its edge, boots steady in the early morning clay, didn't feel victorious. He felt aligned. Not with the system, but with the quiet insistence of something older. The idea that resistance doesn't have to shout. Sometimes it just has to hold, and hold, and hold.